Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, the Lesson 12 Exam Review Part 1. As noted with Part 1, there is a Part 2 webinar coming. It'll be next week, so please be sure to check that out and register if you've not done so already. Hola, bienvenidos a Español. My name is Zach. I'm one of two Spanish teachers here at Penn Foster. Also with us here today is my colleague Dan, available to answer any questions you may have throughout today's session. You do have a variety of ways to get in contact with both of us throughout your Spanish course. Phone, email, chat, text, and appointment scheduling, as you can see on the right-hand side of your slide there. We also have created a bunch of academic resources hosted on those two websites on the left, so please be sure to check those out. It also includes the contact information on there as well. If you've not been to a webinar with us before, you do have the ability to ask any questions throughout today's session if you have one. So please be sure to use that questions box below. So on today's objectives, we are going to cover 5 things. The first is to review the formation and usage of present tense verbs. Second, to practice sentences using verb conjugation with an infinitive. The third, give examples of preterite, which is one of the past tenses in Spanish, regular and irregular verbs in that tense. And fourth, describe the usage of future tense with irregular verbs, and then we'll follow up with any last-minute questions you may have. To start off with, this exam is 2 parts. The first section is translation. You'll be given English sentences. You'll need to put those in Spanish. And then the second section is listening comprehension. You will be listening to a story and summarizing it in your own words in 10 to 20 sentences. You do have a choice of which story you'd like to listen to for this exam. The first option, Papá siempre tiene la razón, Father is always right. This can be found on tape 4L side B, 3.5 minutes up to 15. And also when you get to your exam, there's a link that you can click on if you don't use the tape. Or the alternate option is Circo, an old Ukrainian tale. This one is found on tape 4L side A, 13 to 21 minutes. To start off with, we're going to talk about the present indicative tense. This is probably the most common tense you're going to be using, specifically for this lesson and particularly for this course. So the first thing we're going to do is review some key verb terms. And the first is an infinitive, second stem, third conjugation. So an infinitive is the to form of the verb, and the infinitive will always end with AR, ER, or IR. So an example of that, decir means to say or to tell. You must include the to as part of the translation of an infinitive. The stem is the group of letters that precedes the ending. So in that same example with decir, DEC would be your stem. And then finally, when we talk about conjugation, this is formed by adding an ending to a stem, a new ending we should say. So we're going to be removing that IR from decir in our example and adding new endings, creating subject-verb agreement and your full verb form. And what we mean by subject-verb agreement, basically with a singular subject, you're going to have a singular verb. With a plural subject, you're going to have a plural verb. Couple more verb terms. So person and number. Person identifies who is doing the action of the verb. So we talk about person in first, second, or third. First person meaning I or we, second person you, and third person he, she, or they. These are primarily in English, and they do have some Spanish equivalents that we're going to cover next. And then finally, number identifies how many subjects do the action of the verb. So this can be classified according to singular or plural. So looking at the subject pronouns, we want to show you two charts here, one of the English subject pronouns and one of the Spanish ones, and their equivalents. So as you can see, with the Spanish, we have the first person singular yo, meaning I, second singular tú, meaning you, third person el for he, ella for she, and usted. Usted is a particular form in Spanish. It's not in English, but usted also means you. And the difference between the second and the third person you is formality. So if you use the second person form tú, this is if you're talking to a friend or someone you know very well. However, you would use the third person form usted when talking to someone, maybe you just met, or to show formality. Going over to the plural, we have nosotros, nosotras, depending on gender. Vosotros, the second person plural form, is the form that really is primarily used in Spain. So you won't have to worry about it in your study of our Spanish course. And then finally, ellos and ellas, again, depending on gender. And ustedes, that third person plural form. So continuing with our discussion of present tense, we'll now discuss the translation. So there are two possible translations, as it says here. The first is verb dependent, such as I run, I eat, I sleep. You see that these are not sounding the same, they are verb dependent. And then the second translation is a progressive translation. So I am running, I am eating, I am sleeping, etc. Now there is a difference between present tense and present progressive tense. For the purposes of today's webinar, we're going to stick to present tense, but the present progressive tense really just uses the second translation only, whereas the present tense may use either. So now we'll dive a little bit deeper into conjugation rules, specifically here with present tense. And remember, the conjugation is this idea of forming a verb form with subject-verb agreement. So when we conjugate a verb, we're going to have a two-step process. The first thing is look at the infinitive, remove the infinitive ending, AR, ER, or IR, to determine the verb stem. And then you're going to add the following new endings to the stem, as you can see here. So these charts look pretty similar. The only thing that's really changing is the vowel. In the second, third person singular, first and third plural forms. So in the AR verbs, they're going to have that A vowel, o, as, a, amos, an. ER verbs, o, ace, a, amos, n. Notice that first plural, emos, amos. And with the IR, o, ace, a, emos, n. So next we want to talk about ser and estar. These are the most probably popular verbs in Spanish that aren't action verbs. And these are the verbs to be. And there are two verbs to be in Spanish, and they're used differently depending on context. So when you use forms of ser, this is if you're talking about something permanent, characteristics, telling time, and other ideas. Versus estar, temporary ideas, how you're feeling, where you are at a specific point, location. So looking at our forms of ser and estar, these are going to be considered an irregular verb. An irregular verb is not following the same pattern as we just described, so these forms must be memorized as part of your Spanish learning. So looking at ser, we have soy, eres, es, somos, son. And estar, estoy, estás, está, estamos, están. To give you some examples here, if we said something like soy alto, I am tall, or son las tres, it's 3 o'clock, versus estoy enfermo, I am sick. Hopefully you're not sick all the time. This is a temporary thing. Or están a la escuela, they are at school. So moving on, we're going to now talk about verb phrases and the idea of two verbs back to back in a sentence. So as it says here, when two verbs immediately follow each other, and the first verb is conjugated, again, that idea that we just described about adding a specific ending, your second verb will remain in the infinitive, again, the one that ends in AR, ER, or IR. As you can see here, the two examples we're going to show, acabar and tener, do have a connecting word. And it's not in every single instance that you'll see a connecting word, but it is something that must be included within a translation to be grammatically correct. So acabar, the first verb, meaning just, combined with an infinitive to say you just did something. So yo acabo de terminar el libro, I just finished the book. And for tener, this means to have. Los estudiantes tienen que estudiar. The students have to study. And again, de and que do not have an English equivalent. They definitely must be included for grammatical correctness. So we're going to take a brief pause before moving on. The next topic we're going to talk about is preterite tense, again, one of the past tenses in Spanish. If you do have any questions for Dan, please be sure to send those in, and we'll move on in just a moment. All right, so next we're going to talk about preterite tense. As it says, it is one of the a few past tenses exist in Spanish, one being the preterite. Preterite is equivalent to the English past tense, indicates that something was completed. It's not repeated or ongoing. If you do have a verb that started in the past tense and is continuing, or if you had an action that was repeated, you would use a different past tense called the imperfect. So for today's session, we're not going to focus on the imperfect, but instead focus strictly on the preterite. So just to give you some English examples before moving on, if we said, I ate breakfast every day at 7 a.m., this designates a repeated action. So we're going to use the imperfect tense in that example. Or I was eating breakfast. That would also use imperfect. However, if you had a single event that happened during that action, so maybe I was eating breakfast when the doorbell rang, I was eating breakfast will stay in the imperfect, but when the doorbell rang, since that was a one and done scenario, that would be preterite. So going along with that, with translation, it's very verb dependent. So there's not one set or one clear-cut translation. Translation sound varies. So similar to when we talked about the present tense with verb-dependent translation, the verbs may not sound or look similar or have a similar pattern. So I ate, I drank, I went, I saw. These are all preterite or past verbs. And to conjugate these, we're pretty much following the same sort of steps that we did with present tense, although we have different endings. So first step again to drop the infinitive ending, AR, leaving the stem, and then adding the specific endings to the stem. As you can see in first person and third person singular, there is an accent mark on each of those forms. Accent marks are not required of high school students in the program, although I will tell you applying those rules and knowing those rules now will definitely help you out in your future Spanish course that you may take. So definitely good to know where accents occur in words. Again, endings are pretty similar in both charts, just a couple of vowel changes. So again, these rules follow a regular verb conjugation. We do want to talk about two irregular verbs in the preterite tense. So again, these are verbs that don't follow the pattern, verb forms that you will need to memorize as part of your learning. So our first one is the verb dar, which means to give. And we see that dar is an AR verb, although the rule in the preterite is they take opposite endings, so they actually use those ER, IR endings. And there are no accent marks as you're going through those preterite tense forms. And then another unique thing in the preterite tense are the verbs ir, which means to go, and ser, which means to be. They actually share the same exact conjugation. It is really as you're reading through sentences and context to determine which one you would use. As you can see, though, very irregular, being that they all start with an F. Again, any questions at this time? We're going to next transition into future tense, which good news, it's probably the easiest tense you'll learn in Spanish. But if you do have any questions on present or past tense that we talked about so far, please send those in. So use of the future tense. Future tense is used to describe actions that will happen in the future. So again, if something is going to happen versus will happen, these are actually different constructions and really going to refer to that note at the bottom of the slide. When you're using the future tense, will must be part of the translation. So it could be used positively or negatively, so will or will not. However, if you want to say I'm going to do something, this is actually a verb phrase, ir plus a plus an infinitive. It may sound like the future tense as it's not yet occurred. However, it definitely has a different translation with go. So if we said something like yo, which means I, voy a estudiar, I am going to study, versus the future tense, I will study. So I'm going to study versus I will study. They are not the same. So again, with translation, as you can see, will is part of the English translation of the future tense. However, in Spanish, there's no separate word for the word will, but it is part of the verb form conjugation. Talk about a couple of the types of future tense verbs. As you can see, future tense and the conditional, which we're not going to talk about in today's webinar, are the only two simple tenses that do not drop the infinitive ending. So remember how the preterite and the present steps for conjugation, the first thing we did was remove the AR, ER, or IR. In this case with future, we are not going to remove an ending. Instead, we are just going to add the new ending to the infinitive form. So eos, a, amos, an are those endings. As you can see, there's an accent on all the forms except for the first plural. So if we use an example, andar, which means to walk, andare, A-N-D-A-R-E, I will walk, andarás, you will walk, andará, he or she will walk, etc. And as always, there are irregular forms. These are going to, again, share the same stem between future and conditional tenses. It's definitely a chart that you will need to know. Try to look for ones that are popular, such as decir, to say or to tell, hacer, to make or do. Poner is pretty popular, to put, place, set, example. Salir, to go out or to leave. Tener. These are probably some of the most popular ones that you'll see. And then the final thing we want to talk about today was the conjugation of hacer in the future tense. We wanted to show this one because it may be used on your exam, so a good one to make sure you're aware of. And it is an irregular one. As you can see, we're not using hacer and then adding an ending, but they do have irregular forms in every person, so just be aware of that. And again, this verb means to make or to do. So haré, for example, I will do it. I will make. Harás, you will make, you will do, etc. And that does conclude today's webinar. We will definitely take any of your last-minute preguntas, any questions. As always, you do have the variety of options we talked about at the beginning of the webinar to contact us, so please feel free to use those to your advantage throughout your course. We do thank you for your attendance today. We do hope to see you at part 2. Like I said, that should happen the early part of next week. So please be sure to check that out for registration. Dan and I both wish you buena suerte, good luck in your Spanish exam. And like I said, definitely if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Have a great day.